It was not on the Florida bingo card that I would ever be tracking a winter storm in the Sunshine State.
Late January 2025.
Historic snowstorm paralyzed parts of the South.
A brutal Arctic outbreak breaks free and races south. A runaway beast tearing across North America. From the frozen plains of Canada to the waters of the Gulf Coast, it devours warmth and sunlight alike. By dawn on January 21st, that Arctic blast had reached the Gulf Coast, and winter, real, biting northern winter, had come roaring to the deep south. From Houston's sprawling freeways to the historic streets of New Orleans, from Mobile's waterfront docks to Pensacola's naval yards, snow began to fall. And as millions of Southerners stepped outside into that white silence, they found themselves in a scene that felt almost impossible. A truly once-in-a-century storm rewriting the record books and reshaping the memory of an entire region. So bundle up, y'all, because today we're going back to the historic storm that froze the South and etched itself into the annals of weather history forever. I'm CJ, and this is Florida Man Weather. As with every extraordinary weather story, the Gulf Coast blizzard of 2025 began quietly, not with roaring winds or heavy snow, but with a subtle shift in the atmosphere over the North Pole. In mid-January 2025, a disturbance rippled through the polar vortex, that immense, swirling circulation of frigid air that normally remains locked above the Arctic. Under typical circumstances, the polar vortex acts as kind of an atmospheric gatekeeper, holding the cold in place. But when the vortex weakens or elongates, the frigid Arctic cold can escape the poles and plunge south into the mid-latitudes and even the subtropics. And in early 2025, it did so in truly spectacular fashion. A lobe of Arctic air, dense and unforgiving, broke loose and began to plunge south. The jet stream, the fast-moving river of air that steers weather systems, dipped sharply in response, creating a deep trough that funneled the polar air straight into the heart of the United States. By January 19th, the cold had become a runaway force, surging south across the central US under a powerful northerly flow. Behind the cold front, temperatures would drop by double digits in just hours. And from the Dakotas to the deep south, people would awake to find themselves caught in a rare, continent-spanning chill. The cold wave raced southward until it reached the Gulf states, places where winter usually means a light frost, not frozen roads or ice-laden trees. As it advanced, the air mass bulldozed through the last pockets of warmth, completely erasing any trace of the South's mild winter. By the time the cold front reached Texas, it was already exceeding initial expectations. Residents in Dallas and Houston watched as the temperature fell hour by hour, the air turning brittle and dry. But the front didn't stop there. It continued its relentless march toward the coast, crossing into Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and even the Florida Panhandle by January 20th. For meteorologists, it was the kind of setup that raised eyebrows, the perfect collision course for something big. Meanwhile, over the Gulf, another atmospheric force was taking shape. Satellite imagery that evening revealed an area of low pressure forming along the Texas coastline, just above the Gulf's still warm waters. As the low tracked eastward along the northern Gulf Coast, the dynamics became increasingly volatile. The storm then began to deepen, and as it did so, began to pull warm, moist air northward, while wrapping cold air tightly around its western edge. The boundary where these two air masses meet, known to meteorologists as the deformation zone, became the breeding ground for snow. At the same time, a powerful high-pressure system centered over the Great Plains anchored the Arctic air in place. This sprawling high, with a central pressure near 1,028 millibars, would reinforce the southward flow of frigid air. As the storm spread eastward, temperatures crashed to levels that shattered long-standing records across the South. In Louisiana, the mercury dropped to 26 degrees Fahrenheit, that's -3 Celsius, at New Orleans' Lakefront Airport, the coldest temperature measured there since records began in 1940. Baton Rouge, they would fall to 19 degrees Fahrenheit, -7 Celsius, its lowest in nearly 90 years. In Lafayette, the thermometer bottomed out in a numbing 4 degrees Fahrenheit, negative 15 Celsius, breaking every record dating back to the 1890s, while New Iberia hit 2 degrees Fahrenheit, that's negative 17 Celsius, its coldest temperature since observations began in 1948. Elsewhere, the freeze was also intense. In Mobile, Alabama, the temperature plunged to 6 degrees Fahrenheit, negative 14 Celsius. While not record-breaking, it actually did tie for the city's third coldest reading ever. And across the state line in Pensacola, the morning low hit 13 degrees Fahrenheit, negative 11 Celsius, setting a new daily cold record and ranking amongst the coldest in the city's history. Even in South Texas, readings hovered in the teens, freezing pipes and coating roads in black ice. Meteorologists analyzing the system afterward would call it a near-perfect alignment of timing, geography, and physics. In every one of those elements, the Arctic source region, the jet stream's plunge, the warm Gulf moisture, the anchoring high pressure had arrived in just the right sequence. A deviation of even a few hundred miles or a few hours in any direction by any of these factors could have meant the difference and brought the region a cold, dreary rain. Instead, the storm would go on to produce one of the most extreme snowstorms ever recorded along the Gulf Coast. By the early hours of Tuesday, January 21st, 2025, snow was already falling across Texas, drifting softly under streetlights as the powerful winter storm would make its presence known. In the southern part of the state, freezing rain and sleet had turned to snow overnight, coating rooftops and roads in a thin, glistening layer of ice. And by dawn, the first flakes would reach San Antonio and Austin, where early risers would step outside into a world transformed. The air was sharp and still, the familiar sounds of traffic muted beneath a dusting of white. And as the low-pressure system slid eastward along the Gulf Coast, it gathered strength. By sunrise, the storm had reached the Houston area. Snow began to pour from the sky, thick and steady, blanketing the freeways, palm trees, and suburban lawns alike. By midday, 2 to 4 inches had accumulated across the Houston-Galveston region, enough to bring the bustling city of 3 million people to a halt. Even the beaches of Galveston Island quickly turned white, a sight so rare it hadn't been seen in over 2 decades. A webcam would capture an image that quickly spread across social media, waves rolling onto the snow-lined shore. Elsewhere in Houston, both George Bush Intercontinental and William P. Hobby airports canceled every single flight as runways glazed over with snow and ice. More than 600 flights would never leave the ground that day. Schools and universities closed, and even the Port of Houston, one of the nation's busiest shipping hubs, came to a standstill. Freeways that usually pulsed with constant motion turned eerily silent, and the city's vast highways stretching out under a quiet white sky. A news headline described Houston as a ghost town, and that wasn't far from the truth. By Tuesday afternoon, the storm had strengthened further and was still barreling east. As it crossed into Louisiana, the storm became something truly historic. The National Weather Service in Lake Charles began reporting blizzard conditions, sustained winds over 35 miles per hour, and visibility reduced to nearly zero. And for the first time ever in recorded history, blizzard warnings were issued for the U.S. Gulf Coast, stretching from areas around Beaumont, Texas to Lake Charles, Louisiana, where snow was whipping through the air in winds gusting to over 40 miles per hour. I can only imagine what it must have been like as NWS meteorologists typed the words Gulf Coast and blizzard in the same sentence, something that had truly never simply happened before. By midday, the storm had settled in over almost all of southern Louisiana, and snow began to fall at an astonishing rate. In Lafayette, more than 10 inches would pile up, becoming the city's greatest snowfall event ever on record. The I-10 corridor, stretching east to Baton Rouge and New Orleans, vanished under the deepening drifts of snow. Baton Rouge itself recorded 7.6 inches, its snowiest day since the 19th century. Then came New Orleans, the Crescent City, the city of jazz, Mardi Gras, and balmy breezes, became a world more reminiscent of Chicago, Cleveland, or Buffalo. Heavy snow swept in from Lake Pontchartrain, driven by the icy winds that bent palm trees and reduced visibility to a few feet. And by noon, Louis Armstrong International Airport had recorded 8 inches of snow, shattering every record on the books. In sub-New Orleans suburbs, totals would approach 10 inches. Locals marveled at the sight of the streetcars running through snowbanks with the palm trees dusted with white. Not since the legendary Gulf Coast snowstorm of 1895 had the region seen anything close to this. The 2025 blizzard had arrived as truly once-in-a-century event, one that would be told and retold for generations. And across Louisiana, the snow brought the state's infrastructure to a grinding halt. Virtually the entire stretch of Interstate 10 in the state was shut down, with the long, elevated bridges over the swamps and bayous frozen solid. From the Texas border to Baton Rouge, that's a span of nearly 150 miles, traffic was just stopped completely. Governor Jeff Landry urged residents to stay home, warning that the magical novelty of a snow day would quickly turn dangerous as night fell and the roads refroze. And he was right. Temperatures would plunge into the teens, and parishes across the state were forced to impose curfews, an emergency measure more familiar during hurricanes than with a snowstorm. But as the evening came, the storm continued its eastward march. The next state in its path was Mississippi, where the Gulf Coast cities of Gulfport and Biloxi were pounded by blinding snow. By nightfall, the Mississippi Gulf Coast was blanketed under 7 inches of snow, tying the state's all-time record from 1963. In Waveland, totals would top 10 inches. The quiet fishing towns and casinos along the Gulf Coast shore lay silent beneath the snow, their neon lights glowing through the white haze. The storm would then slam into Alabama, where Mobile took a direct hit. Snow fell so heavily that by the end of the night, 7.5 inches had accumulated, more than the city received during the 1895 storm, and drawing comparisons to the historic 1993 storm of the century. By the late evening, the blizzard would cross into northwestern Florida. In Pensacola, snow began to fall fast and thick, and by the end of January 21st, 8.9 inches had accumulated in northwestern Florida, with a high of 10 inches being recorded in Milton, more than doubling Florida's previous statewide snowfall record. The National Weather Service office in Mobile would actually note that Pensacola had received more snow in one day than in the previous 124 winters combined. And well, because of this, roads across the Panhandle quickly became treacherous, and despite crews' attempts to keep them clear, the I-10 corridor through the entire Panhandle was eventually buried under snow and ice, forcing officials to close nearly 200 miles of highways, from the Alabama state line all the way to near Tallahassee. Images from that night were almost dreamlike. Snow falling around the Welcome to Florida signs, families sledding down roadside embankments on plastic bins and boogie boards, and palm trees standing frozen under a dimly lit gray sky. In Tallahassee, the snow came later and lighter, 2 to 3 inches, but even that was enough to close the roads and send families outside to experience the rare magic of a Florida snowfall. Further east, Georgia and the Carolinas would catch the storm as well. In southern Georgia, snow and ice coated the fields, and by dawn, flurries were drifting as far as the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And by the time midnight arrived on January 22nd, the storm had finally begun to fade, leaving behind a coastline truly transformed. When NASA's Terra satellite passed overhead the next morning, it captured an image that seemed to defy belief. A gleaming white sweep of snow extending from southeast Texas across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and yes, even Florida, curving up into Georgia and the Carolinas. Even the meandering Mississippi River stood out in the delicate white lines, its higher banks having caught more snow than the lowlands around it. Meteorologists and the public alike were left studying the imagery, stunned at what they saw before them. Nearly the entirety of the Gulf Coast, known for its warmth and humidity, now looked like the shores of the Great Lakes. And in an irony that left many shaking their heads, large parts of Alaska and the northern United States had actually received less snow and had less snow on the ground than the Gulf Coast. Later in the day, on Wednesday, January 22nd, 2025, as the storm's center had moved off the Atlantic coast, its reach lingered across the southeast, still spreading a little bit of snow, ice, and bitter cold in its wake. Back along the Gulf Coast, the skies had finally cleared, but the storm left behind a deeper danger, a wave of Arctic air that plunged southward in its wake. As dawn broke on January 22nd, the air was crystalline and still. the snow reflecting the pale morning light. Without clouds to trap the day's warmth, temperatures collapsed. And by sunrise, readings across the South had fallen to near record-shattering lows. 6 degrees in Mobile, 13 in Pensacola, and single digits across much of Louisiana and Mississippi. Accordingly, hard freeze warnings blanketed the region. Even Central Florida, far removed from the snow, felt the sting of the Arctic air as frost glazed over orange groves near Orlando and the Tampa Bay area. The National Weather Service cautioned that the wind chill could cause frostbite, urging Floridians unused to such extremes to take shelter. In all, more than 30 states, from the Gulf Coast to New England, were under some sort of winter weather or cold alerts, tied together by the same icy breath of the departing storm. For the communities along the Gulf Coast, however, the snow's departure didn't mean the crisis was over. Remember, this is the Gulf Coast, as travel and infrastructure were still paralyzed. Large portions of I-10, the great east-west artery along the Gulf Coast from Houston to Jacksonville, was pretty much closed for its entire length. And from Pensacola to Tallahassee, the highway was buried beneath compacted snow and ice, its bridges glittering but deadly. The closure stretched nearly 200 miles, lasting until Thursday afternoon, January 23rd, when crews were finally able to reopen the last sections. In Louisiana, vast stretches of I-10 and I-12, the looping north of Lake Pontchartrain, also stayed closed into Thursday. Their elevated causeways slow to thaw, and across the Gulf Coast states, countless secondary roads were impassable. But not just from snow, from the layer of hard ice now packed beneath it. And highway departments were soon overwhelmed. Many southern states do not own or own a few snowplows or salt trucks, so the workers that could focused their tools on the most critical routes while urging everybody else to stay home. In places where roads could not yet be cleared, officials issued simple, desperate pleas: stay put. States of emergency remained in effect, and much of the South stayed shuttered through January 23rd. For millions of students in K-12 and colleges alike, it was an unexpected and almost comical twist. School closures, not for hurricanes or floods, but for snow. A real southern snow day, one headline joked, for once without a hurricane. Air travel, too, struggled to recover. Though planes began moving again on January 22nd, hundreds of flights remained canceled or delayed, their absence rippling northward to cause unexpected delays as far away as New York and Boston. And as the region thawed, the human toll of the blizzard began to emerge. By January 22nd and 23rd, officials had confirmed at least 8 deaths linked to the storm. Among them were the traffic collisions in Texas, a possible hypothermia death in Louisiana, and one confirmed case near Atlanta where a homeless man succumbed to the cold in a parking lot. Across the South, hospitals treated countless injuries from slips on ice and minor crashes. Shelters opened their doors to the vulnerable, and communities organized to check on elderly neighbors left without heat. Yet, for all the hardship, there was something almost magical in the scenes that unfolded on January 21st and 22nd. In Tallahassee, children who had never seen snow before raced outside at dawn, their laughter echoing down the streets. A 9-year-old girl would exclaim that it looked like a whole lot of white, marveling as she pressed her hands into the snow to make her first snowball. Her family dragged out a boogie board and a skimboard. Beach toys turned sleds and spent the morning sliding down their sloped yard before the fragile snow would melt away. Along the Alabama coast, a pickup truck rolled slowly down a snow-covered beach in Gulf Shores, its tires leaving perfect tracks in the sand-snow mixture. Some locals would build snowmen beside the waterline, their creations adorned with seashells and sunglasses. Others treated the day as a holiday, bundling up to make memories they knew might never come again. Across Gulf Coast states, social media filled with images of wonder and snow-capped palm trees, snowmen wearing beach hats, and neighbors sledding in residential streets on boogie boards, inner tubes, and beach rafts. In New Orleans, a group of locals built a towering snowman in a park, draped it in Mardi Gras beads, and christened it the Crew of Snow, because of course. By the end of the week, Thursday, January 23rd and Friday, January 24th, 2025, the Deep South finally began to thaw. Sunshine broke through the lingering gray skies, and for the first time in a few days, the air felt just a little softer. Temperatures finally climbed above freezing, and the great southern snowpack that had astonished the nation started to melt away. In New Orleans, the thermometer rose above 40 degrees by Thursday, turning the snow into slush along curbs and gutters. By Friday, Pensacola basked in the low 50s, and the once frozen Gulf breeze carried the faint scent of salt again. The spell had broken. Streets slowly reappeared, rivers of meltwater ran along sidewalks, and life began, cautiously, to return to normal. Then came one of the more striking and kind of funny realizations. In January 2025, meteorologists at the NWS New Orleans office noted they had recorded more snow so far during the winter than had the NWS offices in Anchorage, Alaska. Anchorage, normally blanketed in white, had seen less than 5 inches all winter that winter, while the Crescent City sat at 8 to 10. Meteorologists in Alaska even joked about it online, marveling at the role reversal. Meteorologists also noted how the phenomenon was a textbook example of a disrupted jet stream, a southward plunge that had dragged Arctic air deep into Dixie while leaving the far north usually mild. It was, in short, the atmosphere's reminder of its power to surprise, and by every conceivable measure, the Gulf Coast blizzard of 2025 stood as one of the most extraordinary winter events in the history of the American South. And while the blizzard of 1899 remains the South's benchmark for extreme cold, it no longer holds that title for snow. That honor now belongs to 2025. Historians and meteorologists alike drew comparisons. The 1895 storm had blanketed Louisiana and Alabama under 6 to 8 inches. Impressive for its time, but eclipsed by the depths of 2025. The December 1963 snowfall had set Gulfport's old record of 7, now tied. And the February 1973 storm, while memorable across the Southeast, fell short of the Gulf Coast's reach. Even the more recent ice jam storm of 2014 that had paralyzed highways with sleet and a mere dusting of snow paled beside the scale of 2025's blizzard. One would have to look back more than a century to find a true peer. The 2025 Gulf Coast blizzard quickly entered the realm of Southern folklore, a story told with a mix of pride, disbelief, and nostalgia. It had tested emergency systems in new ways, from de-icing bridges in Louisiana to protecting vulnerable residents from freezing temperatures in Florida. It also left behind valuable lessons for planners and emergency managers. In the months that followed, state legislators discussed modest investments in snow removal equipment. Scientifically, the storm became a treasure trove of data for researchers. Meteorologists analyzed jet stream anomalies, temperature gradients, and Gulf Coast moisture interactions, all that had made such a rare event possible. The consensus was clear. While extraordinary, this was again meteorologically sound, just a perfect alignment of ingredients that produced something few thought the South would ever experience. But above all else, the human stories are the ones that linger. As the last patches of snow melted over the weekend of January 24th and 25th, neighborhoods held impromptu block parties. Families swapped photos, shared stories, and laughed about sledding down driveways and making snowmen and beach chairs. There was something deeply unifying about the week the Gulf Coast turned white, a shared memory of wonder amid the disruption. The 2025 blizzard felt almost cinematic. Snowball fights beneath Spanish moss, snowmen standing sentinel on sandy beaches, interstates turned to icy stillness, and finally, sunlight breaking over a landscape reborn. The images from NASA showing the white coastline glowing against the blue of the Gulf, a vision so surreal it bordered on art. But when all was said and done, the blizzard of 2025 passed into the memory as quickly as it had arrived. A brief, dazzling interruption in the rhythm of Southern life. And within days, the snow was gone, but its imprint still lingers everywhere. It lingers in the stories that will be told in future winters over coffee, the photographs framed on mantles, and the quiet awe that still accompanies any mention of those days. When children in Florida built snowmen beside palm trees, when New Orleans fell silent under the drifting snowflakes, and when the South learned the meaning of winter in a way it never had before. Meteorologists would go on to dissect every detail. Policymakers would learn from its lessons. But for the people of the Gulf Coast who lived through it, the storm was something simpler, a truly once-in-a-lifetime wonder. It reminded everyone in the humblest and most human way that the world is still capable of surprise. And so, as the Gulf Coast returned to its characteristic sun and warmth, the memory of that frozen week will remain like a dream, a shimmer at the edge of recollection, the time when Dixie froze over and Old Man Winter came and took a vacation on the Gulf Coast. Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out my channel. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell so you don't miss more content like these. Thanks again, CJ, Florida Man Weather.